I'm going to be sharing my experience with you with cupped corsets and conical corsets, the pros and cons of each one, which one I like better, and which one I think is best for waist training. I would love it if you guys share your perspectives on cupped corsets versus conical corsets, so comment your pros and cons, which one you like better, and why. Okay, so let's talk about cupped corsets. So the pros for a cupped corset, in my opinion, they are more comfy because there's more room for breathing, and I can take larger breaths when I'm wearing a cupped corset. Now, there is this whole thing where do you take breaths through your chest or do you take breaths through your belly? So when I'm wearing a cupped corset, I can take a deeper chest breath. Now, while I'm wearing a cupped ribbed corset, I noticed that the effects, and as you can see by this picture, pretty dramatic. I think cupped corsets look beautifully on, and it really defines the waist and makes it look like my waist is smaller than it actually is, because the cupped rib effects kind of give it, I don't know, I guess a more accentuated look. Another pro to cupped ribbed corsets is that I think could be best for maintenance. So if you've already achieved your reduced waist goal, then maybe a cupped rib corset would be best because it really targets your waist and that's it. Like, it does not push in your floating ribs, which we'll talk about in a second. And by just targeting the waist, as the cup ribbed corset in my opinion does, it can maintain the waist at the goal that you have already achieved by wearing corsets on a regular basis. Also, if you have a wider rib cage or you're a male, you may like cupped rib corsets better because they're just bigger and because, you know, most men have larger rib cages. Okay, let's move on to cons. So back when I said that the cupped rib corset is not pushing in at the floating ribs and they're just kind of cupping the ribs, right? That's why they're called cupped rib corsets. That could also be a con. So in order to achieve your goal waist, there has to be some floating rib movement inward or upward. It's your waist that's mainly doing the pushing in, right? But that's all fat, muscle, tissue, and the like. So it may not be as permanent as, say, pushing floating ribs in. And when you do push in your floating ribs, that is also not permanent because they are your bones and they will adjust if you no longer or stop wearing your corset. Your ribs could expand again. So back to that first con I was talking about with regard to the cupped rib corset not pushing in your floating ribs and just cupping them. Your waist training results may not be as good. You're solely focusing on your waistline, and in order to achieve a really reduced natural waist, again, there has to be some rib movement. Of course, drop your comments down below if you disagree with me. Okay, so another con I think is that results are not as dramatic once you take off your cupped rib corset because there isn't a huge difference because your ribs are not getting pushed in. I did a video not too long ago of me taking off my corset after wearing my conical and then also taking off my corset after wearing my cupped rib corset. It may be hard to distinguish if you're new at corsets and you don't really know like what to look for. If you're looking at my body after I've taken off my conical corset versus my cupped rib corset, you will see that with the cupped rib corset, the difference is mainly being shown in my waist, and with the conical, my ribs have kind of been, you know, they've been pushed in because it's a conical corset or a straight corset. So that's what I mean by like the difference may not be as noticeable if you're solely wearing a cupped rib corset, at least from what my experience has shown. Okay, another con, in my opinion, which some may think this is a pro, is that with a cupped rib corset, it feels like a belt around your waist. Again, if you like that feeling, then it's a pro. But with regard to waist training, I think that cupped rib corsets could potentially, for me, be a con because, again, it feels like a belt just wrapped around my waist and all the pressure is on my waist. There's no pressure down here on my organs or up here on my ribs. The pressure to me just doesn't feel like it's gonna do anything because the pressure is not, I guess, balanced. Like with a conical corset, you know, you feel the pressure up here on your waist and down here. But with a cupped rib corset, it's just solely on your waist. Initially, I thought that this would be a benefit. Like, okay, the pressure is just gonna be on my waist, meaning it's just gonna be focusing on closing in my waist and giving me that reduced waist that I'm looking for. Come to find out, For me, it doesn't feel good. Again, it feels like a belt. The pressure is not balanced all over my torso. And honestly, it just kind of feels uncomfortable to say the least. Hi, jump scare. It's me. I'm editing. In the beginning, it was super comfortable wearing my cups rib corset. But once I started tightening it more and more, it started to get tight solely in the waist, which over time can lead to uncomfortability. I didn't start realizing this until I started tightening it up more and more. So keep that in mind. I wear corsets solely for waist training purposes, although I do like sometimes if I'm feeling anxious, if I go anywhere out in public, I get really nervous, and sometimes I even cry because I'm so nervous. And when I wear my corset, I don't feel that butterfly feeling in my tummy, and it kind of like just makes it feel better. So when wearing a cup strip corset, I don't necessarily feel the pressure on my belly. Again, it's just solely around my waist. Now, when I first heard the term cut in half, I was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. Someone on YouTube did a video where she was in her corset and she mentioned that the corset cuts her in half. And I didn't understand that, but now I understand it. With a cupped rib corset, it kind of feels like it's cutting you in half. It's cutting you at the waist because all of the pressure is solely on your waist. So it feels like you're being cut in half, which again for me is a con because I wear corsets for waist training. I need to have some pressure on my floating ribs in order to achieve that reduced waist look. What do you think about cupped rib corsets? Pros, cons? Drop them in the comments. And let's move on to conical corsets. Pretty much what it's doing is it's pushing in my floating ribs, which are down here, and then it just tapers off and goes up to my underbust. Let's talk about some pros for conical corsets. The biggest pro is that the results are more dramatic. After I wear a conical rib corset for even like 4 to 6 hours and I take it off, I notice a difference in my waist. It may be temporary, it may last a few hours, especially if I'm gonna eat right away, or I'm gonna go on a walk. You know, your body expands with movement and with eating. But overall, I think the results with a conical ribbed corset are more dramatic because they push in the floating ribs, which of course can take a very long time, but it does help when you want to achieve permanent results with waist training. Maintenance is of course still required, so remember that. So you will eventually attain a smaller natural waist, or the appearance of. Those are pretty much the only pros to conical, but I think that that's the main thing with conicals, is that they are used for waist training purposes because they push in the floating ribs, and that's like the only pro that I need for my purpose of wearing corsets. Let's talk about some cons now. Conical ribbed corsets can be less comfy in the rib cage because again, they're pushing them in slightly down here, the floating ribs that are down here. And if you're wearing a corset that has a really small rib spring, which is the measurement around your underbust, then it could feel a little tight on you because it's also going to be pushing in the ribs up here, and it's not going to be as comfortable as a cupped rib corset would feel because it's just cupping the corset. Rather now it's pushing all of the ribs in, including the floating ribs. So again, less comfy in the rib area. Another con, which kind of isn't just for conical ribbed corsets, but I'm just gonna throw it in here, is that just because conical ribbed corsets push in your floating ribs doesn't mean that your ribs will stay that way forever, and that is why maintenance is required with waist training. If you stop wearing corsets, your floating ribs may as well go back to their natural state. Again, that is why maintenance is 100% required. I don't know how many times I remind myself on a daily basis that maintenance is required, but you know, it is, just like diet and exercise. Okay, so those are the pros and cons, in my opinion, of the conical or straight ribbed corset. Again, let me know your comments down below, what you agree with, what you disagree with, and anything that I did not add.